Untold Uncut, Opportunities in a Conflicted World, Part 1. Patrick Horgan's here, Director of Global Network, Rolls-Royce, and Professor Funmi Olonisakin, Vice President, International Engagement and Service, King's College, London. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Good to see you. Funmi, if I could start with you. We've had a couple of big chats there, David Lammy, Peter Mandelson. It's a different world we live in from when Labour was last in power. And if you listen to Lord Mandelson, they're just a shoe throws away from being in power. The world we live in, the geopolitical world we live in, how important is it with that geopolitical backdrop to have a closeness of ties between the UK and India?
Oh, I think it's extremely important. Extremely important, not just because the UK finds itself alone at a moment when the world is reconfiguring itself. It's alone because it's outside of the European Union. But perhaps actually, with all of the negativities that have surrounded that, it might be a good time for the UK to form a different kind of alliance, if it can use that to connect to different parts of the world. Who made the point that India is no longer non-aligned in that sense? I think the non-alignment, non-aligned politics is shifting. If you look at the voting pattern in the UN Security Council, for example, over Ukraine, you begin to see the kinds of alliances across regions, that the global south itself is becoming a big bloc, a big player, and India is going to have to play a big role here. But the part of the world that is often overlooked, and no one is really paying that much attention to how it is shifting and how it is beginning to reconfigure itself, because its leadership structure actually doesn't really show much, is Africa.
Yeah.
And India, I think, will serve as a big bridge to Africa. An alliance between the UK and India in that part of the world and in the rest of the global south could be game-changing.
Yeah.
I'm not sure much attention is being paid to that. And of course, it's important that you look at China very carefully, not least because of the competition. Less cooperation, but cooperation will be needed because of the big issues of the day. Competition between China and the US, and all of what might happen in China's part of the world. Taiwan, an example, a lot of attention is being paid there. But Africa is one of the regions where it will be played out.
And I'm going to ask you all about Africa in a minute. So hold that thought. There's a lot to digest there, Patrick. From Rolls-Royce's perspective, how does a global company like yourself operate in that just ever-changing, complex geopolitical backdrop?
Well, we, in common with any company with global reach, and you have to bear in mind the nature of our business, if you're in civil aerospace, defense, and power systems, then actually this kind of environment we're in touches all of those business areas intimately. Civil aviation and aerospace is the connectivity of people traveling around the globe. It depends on a certain level of stability for growth. It's very closely connected to GDP growth as an indicator of its overall health. And then you have defense. Well, for heaven's sake, defense is clearly a business that is affected by geopolitics, for better or for worse. And power systems, there the discussion is all around energy security, linked back both into the global security environment and to the challenges around climate change and sustainability. And I would strongly endorse what Funmi's just said, about this being a period when the world is in a state of reconfiguration. And so for all of our businesses, we are both impacted by that reconfiguration, and in a certain sense, we are at the sharp and pointy end of a lot of that change. So it is absolutely core to us as a business to stay close to these developments, to be engaged in the necessary conversation.
How do you stay engaged? As an audience, I'm sure people are wondering, given that you're everywhere, you're every piece of the pie there, aren't you? How do you stay engaged?
Well, we feel it through our business, and it is revealed in the data of our business on an ongoing basis. But in practical terms, of course, we also do what a responsible company does. We make sure that we have people with real knowledge, with insight, on the ground, in the places that matter, so that we have a constant feedback from the center back to the regions, and we make sure that we are connected, not just center regions, but in a network manner, hence my title, Global Network, to make sure that people are speaking to each other and we don't miss those unexpected points of connection that may not previously...
Explain to our
be
audience
focused on.
what is a director of global network, because it might be a title some are, they haven't come across. What is it, and what do you do, and why is it important?
Essentially, I am responsible for geography, including geopolitics, within the group. In other words, making sure that as we form our strategy, we have a clear understanding of the places that matter for us, our interests in those places, and that understanding is reflected back into the strategy process.
Yeah.
And this means also our representation in key hubs around the world. We have regional presidents in India and South Asia, in Southeast Asia, in Greater China, dotted around the world in key hubs, and that team all reports back to me. So the regional leads for Rolls-Royce are the global
So
network.
you're getting wonderful global viewpoints just the whole time, and you just suck it all up, do you?
Well, it's quite overwhelming at times.
Is it?
You're quite right. It's a constant stream of information and inputs, and of course, the world is not a dull place at the moment. So you're never short of things that you have to sink your teeth into and go to a deeper level.
Funmi, talk to me about Africa. You mentioned it a couple of times. It needs to be discussed more, doesn't it?
Yes, but Africa is where people think about going to for natural resources, for raw materials. It's where they go to because they see conflict and they're trying to intervene in conflict. All of the world in between that is often overlooked. And what's our world in between that? It's a new generation of people, average age of 19.5 or 20 years if you like. It's a new way of thinking. It's transnational connections. We've talked about India and technology and all of that. But it's about 200 million new voters in the next 5 years. And they will be making different decisions. You can look at 2030, 2032, and see how Africa will change tremendously. There will be demands for new agreements, for new ways of using its raw materials. The African Free Trade, Continental Free Trade Area and Agreement begins to take a new life, because for the first time, that bloc, a new bloc in Africa, will start acting like the EU. Not because it will mimic the EU, but because it will start looking inward. And that will become so pivotal to what happens to those natural resources, to those raw materials, to the ways in which security is thought of in Africa. If you look at the Horn of Africa, you probably have about 17 militaries there, including China, right? And that gateway, that trade route begins to look different, because those organizations or those Africa as a bloc will start making new requests of the world. I don't think anyone is looking 10 years ahead and how Africa
What does it look
is
like
changing.
then? What request does it make of the world?
Oh, it makes a request of the world in which you cannot just, cart away raw materials without putting something on the continent, in which you can't be present 20 militaries across the continent without replacing them with African militaries. It will be extended states, it will be changing regional blocks, and you're seeing that move at the moment, because the Sahel is going to look different. The presence of the US, of the EU, thinking about migration and terrorism, will not continue in the same way with a changed set of leaders, because they have organized transnationally, they have thought differently from this old set of elite. It's going to change rapidly, not without conflict, but it will be a new kind of Africa, and it would be acting differently and asking for new things.
Yeah. What's the intelligence you get from Africa? From your people on the ground?
Look, Africa is clearly demographically, in terms of growth prospects, for the reasons that Funmi just explained, it is clearly a fascinating prospect. We all would love to see stability, an extended period of growth, greater prosperity, and then selfishly for businesses the opportunity that comes with that. And we would love to be a part of that growth story. We're still not there yet, and I...
Why aren't you there yet?
Well, for exactly those reasons.
Yeah.
We have not yet had that extended period of stability and prosperity that provides a foundation for businesses of our type. So there are interesting and valuable opportunities, but not yet at scale. For other businesses, for more consumer-facing businesses, addressing the younger demographic, I would say Africa is already a really significant business. For those that are doing infrastructure and extractive industries, again, for the reasons you suggested, it's clearly very important. And in the world of looking for secure and resilient supply chains, Africa has a renewed importance in that light also. So for all of those reasons, Africa is important, but for us, it will be a longer-term story. And of course, the story today, in terms of where is the place that immediately has the scale, the demographic shape, the existing business opportunities, the existing skills base, and the prospect of an extended period of 7% plus GDP growth within one state, that is India.
Yeah.
And that's the reason why we have a particular focus on India and are here today at the India Global.
On the issue of supply chains, what's the global supply chain network now looking like in the wake of COVID, in the wake of the upheaval we've seen in recent years, in the wake of the Russia-Ukraine war? What does it look like now? What's it going to look like? And what are the implications of that? Funmi.
I think things are in flux.
Right.
Things are in flux, and we need to watch this space for the next 3 years to start to reorganize itself. Why are things in flux? Because if you look at the places where, if you look at the movement, I would say, for example, if you look at China in Africa, if you look at India in Africa, you're seeing a rapid increase. And you're also seeing a change in behavior. That change in behavior in those places where you get raw materials from is what is obvious. And it's a post-COVID thing. And that's why they're beginning to vote differently, think differently, and behave differently. What's the post-COVID thing? You saw the movement across the world of vaccines. And the continent of Africa probably was, least, had the least share of them, because when it came to intellectual property, it wasn't shared. And you can begin to look at 3 motivating factors that has put this in flux. The places where you get raw materials from immediately changes its pattern, but you have a new way of thinking from China. India is following suit, and you can actually see the way India has behaved the past 2-3 years, that it wants to really be in the center of things. But then you're also thinking of groups of states that are thinking, maybe the West is not where to go very readily. But the play on the ground, the way things are configured at the moment on the ground, does not suggest that the West will not be a part of this equation. So things are in flux. It's not very easy to say what this will look like in the near future, in the far future.
I think the challenges that you mentioned of the last couple of years, 2-3 years, COVID and indeed geopolitical complexity means that we have seen the shift from just in time to just in case, that the the need for resilience to be designed into the supply chain, which of course involves cost. So you don't get the resilience without also incurring some additional cost as you build that resilience in through the choice of suppliers, through having multiple options in terms of supply, and through building up stocks when stocks are necessary and you have no alternatives. So all of those things combined make it a somewhat different environment for supply chain, consistent with a world that is being reconfigured, just as you said.
We've had the growth of nationalism, protectionism, populist movements in recent years. Because of that, we're living in an increasingly uncertain environment, and many are talking about deglobalization, or at least a slowdown or a reversal. Discuss. It's like an essay at university. Discuss.
So I mean, the reason I talk about Africa a lot is because of the conversations that are going in there. Add to that de-dollarization.
Well, even better. What a great chat. De-dollarization.
De-dollarization.
Discuss. Just have de-dollarization. Discuss.
Exactly. And that's...
I go for it.
That flux is part of what's happening. If you have a group of states, so it's a win-win for states like India, right? I'm not sure immediately that it's a win-win for China, for example, because in all of that fierce nationalism that is going on across the world, the places where the world economies will depend on are going to make a different set of decisions. And if you have a bloc that decides that the currency at play is not going to be the US dollar, are they going to say they're going to the Chinese currency at the end of the day? And I think that's, that's in natural expectations. But suddenly, it's not clear cut when you see how that debate is going. That instead of the US dollar, we're going to, use, it will not be immediately that we're going to China, but I think that's where India begins to intervene in that space. Yeah. And that would look very, very interesting. But if the dollar is not the currency of the world, that changes. So all that nationalism is for what?
So I'm not going to pick up the de-dollarization.
Why not?
But I will tackle the de-globalization topic. A year or more ago, I was in a discussion where somebody referred to the era of hyper-globalization as if this was something that was already in the rear-view mirror, that actually we had already gone beyond that phase and we're now into another period. I think it is very clear that these major shifting of the tectonic plates, the US-China relationship, the need to address climate change and sustainability, and now the need to consider what is it that comes in this post-Cold War era. We have to find a better way of expressing that, but you all know what I mean. What comes in this period beyond is still to be determined.
Yeah.
And Jake Sullivan, US National Security Advisor's speech in April on US economic leadership was actually quite specific about this, that there is an intention on the part of the US to enter into a new phase, to redefine the rules of the road for the global system, of course with US interests taking primacy, but with a view to the impact on the rest of the world. And the rest of the world will have to step up to that discussion, engage and influence in order to have a say.
Can we do 90 seconds on Russia? Who's going to be brave enough to answer this question? We've had an eventful weekend, haven't we, Funmi? What's the ripple effect of what occurred on Saturday in Russia?
I think a bit of destabilization of the status quo. We probably will see a settled... we'll probably see some form of settlement of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, or between Russia and the West. I don't think you can sustain.
You think it'll and what does the settled outcome look like?
The settled outcome is not, I know if you're looking at the US, they want to see a decisive outcome. I don't think it's going to be decisive, really. But you have an outcome in which, in the end, Ukraine joins the European Union, but I'm not sure that in the end, the NATO alternative is going to be clear-cut. It will have to be negotiated.
Patrick, 30 seconds on Russia.
Look, I think if you're asking specifically about the events of last weekend, I think we can summarize it very quickly, and that is that the veneer of stability and things running according to plan from the point of view of the Kremlin, and from the point of view of the Kremlin persuading and sustaining that belief with the Russian populace at large, it becomes ever harder to sustain. And to the extent that that hastens an end of the conflict, so much the better.
Yeah, well said. Brilliant. Big round of applause for our guests. Thank you so much, the two of you.